and then ended up at the end saying, you know, language is the best reflection or our best indicator of what society is or how it works. There's a sense in which we can't do without these supra-level concepts such as society, even though we're all somewhat uncomfortable with them these days, particularly those of us like Jan who focus on that micro level of analysis where you become so acutely conscious of the extraordinary diversity, heterogeneity of the social space. At which point one does start, as one zooms in and the picture dissolves into pixels, one does start to wonder if the picture itself really denotes something real. Well, my talk is in a sense about that, or an exploration of an aspect of that. That is, I would say that yes, there is a sense in which that system made up of all these heterogeneous circumstances and speech acts and so on, the system of those acts together does have a real existence and behaves in patterned ways, in ways that are amenable to exploration and analysis. And the key aspect of the forms that society, that social construct takes, has to do with the ways in which the members of that social group imagine it to be. That is, the social imaginary, if that's the term we adopt for those shared ways of thinking about what it is that we are all members of in our diverse speech acts from day to day, but nonetheless feeling ourselves to be members at the same time of something larger than ourselves, and in fact involving many people whom we will never meet in person, but with whom we sense a kinship, in a sense, a shared occupation of whatever it might be, a territory, a profession, a way of life, a set of values, and so on. That social imaginary has an important constitutive role to play, and in fact may very well influence the kinds of linguistic choices that we make. So this is why I've become interested in the last little while in this notion of cosmopolitanism, which appears in the title of my talk, which is the ethics of Esperanto, norms of practice in a cosmopolitanized speech community. So just briefly then about cosmopolitanism, just to sort of set the stage. It's a notion that has become increasingly talked about, written about in sociology and the sociology of modernity, let's say, and in political science, as a way of thinking about something of a shift going on between the era of what Zygmunt Bauman calls solid modernity, or Ulrich Beck calls first modernity, which is kind of the classic era of the establishment of nation states, of the kinds of bulwarks of social order that we're all familiar with, health systems, legal and police systems, public schools, and so on and so forth. So all the trappings of what we think of as modern society. It appears now that we're in a different historical conjuncture, that if one thinks of solid modernity, I like Bauman's term, as having been about building things to last, about constructing structures of control and certainty as much as possible, so that all the vicissitudes of human existence could be limited, restricted, and one could look forward to a long and peaceful and fruitful life within strictly controlled or protected circumstances. What we're in now is clearly more fluid, it's more riskful for the participants. There's a lot of uncertainty now that's quite different from what the era of solid modernity was trying to accomplish. And in these fluid lives we lead, that of course play themselves out also linguistically, in the kinds of languaging, this fluidity of discourse, and the borrowing of different repertoires and so forth that we've been talking about. that fluidity comes along with new ways of imagining that social order that we're part of. This era of liquid modernity, as Bauman calls it, or second modernity, as Beck refers to it. And cosmopolitanism is a way of thinking about where that second modernity or liquid modernity might be headed, or what kinds of ethical and social ideals might guide our actions. What might we see ourselves as involved in constructing, co-constructing together? What are we aiming at here? So cosmopolitanism explicitly has both this normative aspect, which you get in books like this one, Cosmopolitanism of Philosophy for Global Ethics. So this is the kind of moral normative framework for thinking about how we should live our lives according to cosmopolitan ideals. But it also is an explanatory framework for thinking about how people actually enact a sense of belonging to non-national, transnational communities. And so books like this one, Cosmopolitanism in Practice, examine that aspect of things. And it's this in particular that I'm interested in exploring with you today. That is using the Esperanto community as an instance of cosmopolitanism in practice. And Esperanto was interesting because of the fact that it's so linguistically defined. Most cosmopolitan cultural communities, of course, have a linguistic dimension, naturally. In this book, for instance, there is a study of UN personnel moving around the world, working now in Nairobi for a few years, now in New York, now somewhere else, and deploying language, obviously, as part of that experience, part of that way of enacting a certain kind of cosmopolitan identity that comes with belonging to the UN and seeing yourself as part of what the UN is trying to achieve, and actually living this out in mundane ways in one's everyday life. So that's one example of how one might look at cosmopolitanism through a linguistic framework, among other things, by looking at the language practices of people who live these kinds of cosmopolitanized lives. Well, the Esperanto community offers another kind of cosmopolitanism in practice, which is interesting. It's been around for quite a while. You are probably aware that Esperanto got its start in 1887, so that's more than 125 years ago. So that's quite a while for a community to have become self-maintaining and to have built up a certain repertoire of self-understandings, of discourse about its own identity, its own ways of being in the world, about what it sees itself as trying to enact in its everyday life. So let me take you then a little bit inside the Esperanto community. It must be said, I don't know of your relative levels of familiarity with the Esperanto phenomenon. People vary very greatly in terms of their knowledge of it or their attitudes towards it. So I don't feel that I can take very much for granted here. There's not time really to go into any details, so let me just say that Zamenhof, as you probably know, Esperanto got its start as the project of a single individual, Ludwig Zamenhof, a Jewish eye doctor living in what is now Poland, what was then the western edges of the Russian Empire. First little book was published in 1887. Immediately attracted a small but slowly growing community of initially written users of the language. And starting from around 1900, began what became a very swift transition into a speech community, a transnational speech community that in the course of the next few decades developed all kinds of norms, speech norms, cultural norms, and so on, that really created a self-sustaining and autonomous, in a sense, linguistic community that continues to exist and perpetuate itself and evolve in various ways in the present day. So the reason why Esperanto did this and many other projects to do the same kind of thing, so many other projects inspired by the notion that in a world where transnational communication and travel increasingly called for linguistic resources that were not bound to particular nation states and particular territorial and political ways of life, but might offer some kind of expression of transnationality or global identity. There have been well over 1,000 such projects, and of them all, Esperanto is the only one to have achieved this level of social realization to really quite a remarkable degree. And this has probably a lot to do with the fact that Zamenhof saw it explicitly as primarily a social problem, not a linguistic problem. And so from the start it was very clear that the language would be the property of its speakers. Anyone who wants can learn Esperanto and use it for their own purposes in as creative and free-flowing ways as seem appropriate to them. Basically his attitude was, if it works, try it out and see what happens, and the community itself will see to the language continuing to evolve within a framework that is genuinely useful for all or most of its users. So it's this social life of Esperanto that makes it suitable, obviously, for study as an example of cosmopolitanism in practice. And like other cosmopolitan communities studied in this book and others like it, the Esperanto community is characterized by things such as a worldwide distribution, speakers in most countries around the world, a problematic relation to the nation state, a common set of dispositions that involve both a familiarity or rootedness in local cultures, but also a certain strangeness to them, a sense in which Esperanto speakers can travel and visit one another around the world and have at the same time a sense of belonging, a sense of meeting the other and finding kinship in them, and also a sense of strangeness, of never quite being fully at home. There's a sort of tentative quality to Esperanto communication, Esperanto identity, that is continually felt by its speakers. Characterized also by what we might term transnational relationship networks that perpetuate themselves across generations, whether through families, where parents pass the language on to their children, who pass it on to theirs, pass it on to theirs. There are many examples of families where that has taken place, but also relationships that resemble more the kind of lineages that you find in Buddhism, for instance, where there'll be a teacher of Esperanto who passes on a certain understanding, a certain repertoire in the language to the people that he teaches, who then pass that on to the people they teach, and so on. So in all these ways, the Esperanto community is interconnected, highly interconnected at a global level, in ways that are intriguing and difficult to categorize. So there's thinking about this then as a cosmopolitanized language community, there's three aspects of it that seem to me particularly intriguing conceptually. One is identity and community. The second is the discourse of the community itself, both oral and written, how its cosmopolitanization expresses itself linguistically. And thirdly, ideas about ethics and justice, which the title of my talk refers to. So we'll come to that in the end. So let me give you a quick picture of these three, of this exemplification, instantiation of cosmopolitanization in a language community. So, first of all, with identity and community, what does it mean to be a speaker of Esperanto, or an Esperantist, as they are often referred to? Is the collective of Esperanto users a community or a movement? A Gemeinschaft or a Gesellschaft? A quasi-ethnic linguistic minority or a transnational group of linguistic hobbyists? All of the above. These are not merely academic questions to be answered through sociological study by outsiders, as has been done, but they are also issues hotly debated within the Esperanto community. And they assume wider significance in the context in which we're talking about here if we view these as questions of cosmopolitan identity in a self-consciously transnational, language-based diaspora. So, that is, Esperanto debates around community and identity bespeak a profound struggle to reimagine the roles of language and language use as primary identity markers. Zamenhof himself saw this as a problem. As Esther Shore wrote in an essay a couple of years ago, he wondered how a group of human beings with varied national origins could possibly attain and sustain the bonds of peoplehood. How could this collection of the users of Esperanto come to feel themselves to be a community or a people? And for Zamenhof, the answer was not through language alone, but also through adherence to a common ethical framework, which he developed and called at first Hellenismo, after a Jewish contemporary, a Jewish teacher from the time of Jesus Christ, and then rebaptized in Esperanto Homaranismo, which means more or less the creed of being a member of humanity. Now, by the time Zamenhof got around to formulating this as a kind of creed for the Esperanto community, the movement was more or less in the hands of a group of Western, rationalist, skeptical, atheistic, or at least secularist intellectuals who, to whom this idea of some sort of common ethical, global ethical framework was anathema. They preferred to see Esperanto as a purely technical means of fostering international communication. And ever since, in the debates, the self-conception of the Esperanto community, this tension between seeing Esperanto as a neutral technology and seeing it instead as an ethical project, a project of bringing about human brotherhood, you might say, at the global level. The tension between those two ways of looking at the movement played themselves out in all kinds of ways in the self-conception of the community and in the actual speech acts, the linguistic choices made by its members. And in a moment, when we come to the question of discourse, I'll give you some examples of that. So this is an example of one of the ambiguities or one of the tensions that runs through the ontology of Esperanto as a language community. And associated with it are others. How much Esperanto must one speak to become a member of the community? Because everyone starts off as a second language speaker, apart from a handful of children learning it as one of their first languages. And they have no particularly privileged status within the culture. What is the relationship of Esperanto culture to national cultures and languages? What is the relationship between Esperanto and place? It's intriguing to note that some of the key moments in Esperanto history are closely associated with particular places. Warsaw as the birthplace of the language, Boulogne-sur-Mer as the site of the First World Congress, Geneva and later Rotterdam as the headquarters of the most important international organization of Esperanto speakers, Budapest as the center of its first significant literary movement. For all that it is a language without a state or defined territory, Esperanto has a definite and dynamic geography, one that continues to develop across many different layers, for instance, through the many hundreds of Esperanto monuments, street names, and so on to be found around the world. So there's this curious sense in which Esperanto is a language without a place, without a defined place, and yet it finds ways of identifying itself with particular places that perform an important cultural role within the self-conception and the stories that the community tells about itself. The annual World Esperanto Congress provides some of the clearest indices of the Esperanto community's struggle to define itself. Some traditional features of the Congress program date from the earliest years of the movement, such as the ritual singing of the Esperanto anthem to open and close the week-long proceedings. A particularly poignant illustration of the community's ambivalent relationship with nationalism can be found in the greetings of the Landaj Asocioj, the National Esperanto Associations, towards the end of the opening ceremony. For half an hour, a long line of kongresanoj, congress-goers, some attired in national costume, snakes across the stage in front of, the 2,000 people in the audience, each uttering a few Esperanto words of welcome on behalf of their compatriots back home. The event symbolizes, one might say, Esperanto's triumph. Look, here we are, a truly global community, meeting as brothers. And, at the same time, it's failure. Here we are, still chained to the institutions that have divided us for centuries. We still haven't come up with a better way of defining ourselves than as a collection of members of nation-states. Okay, so on to talk a little bit about the discourse of the community and how these tensions play themselves out there. Obviously, the effort to define exactly what kind of community Esperanto represents and what kind of identity it offers is tied up with the question of what kind of language it is. One of the tensions here is between simplicity and complexity, or what one might say is Esperanto a simple language, easy to learn, or is it a rich language, fully capable of all the nuances of literary and technical expression that we would find in national languages. Esperanto's core vocabulary is very productive thanks to its rich system of affixes. For some in the movement, then, there are both aesthetic and ethical reasons to keep the essential stock of word roots as small as possible. On the other hand, Esperanto is also designed to make it easy to borrow words from other languages, adapting them to its phonology and morphology. So, for others in the movement, such importing of word roots is essential for the language to adapt to new technical and literary contexts. It may be hard for outsiders to imagine the passions invested in this debate, known popularly as the battle between skemismo, that's the simplicity side of things, and naturalismo, which is that openness to borrowing lexical material from all kinds of sources. At its core, I would argue, this debate is not just about forms of language. It's also about competing cosmopolitan visions. Either Esperanto as a maximally democratic, inclusive language that places as small a burden as possible on its speakers, and particularly on the speakers of non-European languages, given that the lexicon is largely European in origin, versus a maximally differentiated, culturally layered language that takes great literary languages such as English, French, German, Russian as its model. Each of these visions continues to exercise considerable sway within the community as a whole. So these visions really do have concrete effects on the language choices that people make, both at the micro level, at the level of ordinary conversation and word choice in writing and so forth, and larger, as it were, linguistic policy decisions about the directions in which the language should be taken. And then a second tension that it's worth noting between Esperanto as an auxiliary language and Esperanto as an autonomous language. Esperanto is only used in multilingual contexts. Right? Every Esperanto speaker speaks other languages, often several. And so the influence and interaction of other languages is omnipresent in the linguistic practices of the community. Tonkin has argued that in a certain sense Esperanto is a translated language, borrowing its semantics initially from Zamenhof's knowledge of other languages, and lately from the negotiation of the semanticity of the first language speakers who come to it as a second language. Now, of course, in any language, and we've been talking about this, semantic negotiation is perpetually unfinished and incomplete. But in Esperanto, given the diversity of the linguistic backgrounds of its speakers, and the fact that it is the native language of virtually no one, this negotiation is surely particularly intense and particularly visible, to an even greater extent than, say, if we're looking at English as a lingua franca. So these would be lingua franca phenomena that are exemplified in the ordinary discourse of the Esperanto community. And yet, even if the norms of spoken and written Esperanto are more elastic than is typically the case in other languages, they clearly exist and evolve, demonstrating a manifest will on the part of the community to meet on common ground. This linguistic autonomy is echoed by a certain degree of cultural autonomy in the form of original literature, music, intellectual discourse, and so on, whose origins can be found once again in the earliest years of the movement. So, on the one hand, we have a cosmopolitanism that strives to be maximally open to the other linguistic and cultural influences, and on the other, a cosmopolitanism that strives to be uniquely itself, to provide a cosmopolitanized linguistic and cultural space that has no equivalent elsewhere. If one compares the situation to that of English as a lingua franca, one can see that Esperanto has significant advantages in both respects. That is, it is less weighed down by native speaker norms, allowing it to accept a greater variety of ways of saying things, both by borrowing and by invention. Yet, it would be illusory to see this process as straightforward or uncontested. Every Esperanto speaker comes to the language with cultural baggage, the legacy of a broader social, linguistic environment characterized by drastic differences in power and agency. Esperanto discourse is the product of struggle and resistance within the movement itself, as well as in the constitution of Esperanto-defined communicative spaces vis-a-vis more everyday naturalized language environments. It is this conflictual, contextual, tentative version of cosmopolitanism that is embodied in Esperanto discourse and, to my mind, makes it interesting for the kinds of issues that we've been discussing here. So last, and I have about 1 minute left, I think, to come to that question of ethics. Ethics and justice, the moral or ethical framework that emerges out of this self-conception and these practices. It's inevitable when you have struggle and resistance going on, when you're trying to carve out some kind of autonomous self-conception, that normative visions of linguistic justice, fairness, equity are going to be invoked. We've already seen how those get invoked in the debates over the kind of language Esperanto is. But they're equally central to how the movement represents itself and to others, such as in forums at the United Nations, where the Universal Esperanto Association has traditionally aligned itself with the broader human rights agenda. More recently, issues of social justice and sustainable development have been arising in the context of Esperanto spread into outside the industrialized countries and into such relatively impoverished countries as Nepal, Mongolia, Indonesia, Benin, Nicaragua, to name a few. So you can see that there's a dynamism here that in itself leads to changes in the self-conception of the Esperanto community and what it's about and how the language is to continue to evolve. What sets it apart, what makes it particularly interesting, I think, for the kinds of issues we're concerned with here, is that this isn't just an advocacy movement, it's also a movement for ethically inspired practice. That is, it's not only concerned with what Beck calls the idea of a cosmopolitan yet to come, some future ideal to which we can strive, even if we never attain it, and that is how Esperanto is very often seen by outsiders. But it's also concerned with the attempted living out of that ideal, right now, in as wide a range of linguistic domains and contexts as possible. And it's that, the complexity, the ambition of that undertaking that makes it fascinating. And it finds expressions in things that can take the form of a manifesto, a declaration of principles, such as the Manifesto de Prago, the Prague Manifesto from a few years ago, or literary forms such as the remarkable science fiction epic Poema de Utnoa by Katalin poet Abel Montegut, which came out a few years ago. So, to conclude, I think the value of Esperanto for normative debates over multilingualism and multilingual policy making doesn't lie in that sort of classic image of Esperanto as a second language for all, this kind of decontextualized picture of what it represents. Much more, it lies in what it has to teach us about the relationship between ethical principles and linguistic practice. That is, what happens if you try to live out a particular kind of linguistic ideal in the messy, complicated world of everyday, mundane linguistic practice. So, in that sense, I think you can see Esperanto as a kind of propedeutic. That is, by learning and practicing Esperanto, you develop a cosmopolitan understanding of language on a broader scale that can inform a broader ethical multilingualism. So, with that thought, I would like to leave. Thank you.